Hi there and welcome to Rick's Woodworking. Today we're going to do a storage cabinet for a Cricut. We're going to have space for rolled vinyl pieces down here, plus a heat press next to it, and then above for 12 by 12 sheets of vinyl. The Cricut's going to sit way on top, and we have a height restriction. So total height's only about 26 inches on this one, since it lives under a shelf in a closet. What we're going to start with right now, though, is this one area for the rolled vinyl. It's made up of a combination of 1/2 inch and 1/4 inch plywood. So over at the table saw, we're going to start with ripping this to 12 inches. That's the overall depth of the piece. We need 6 pieces to complete the entire structure. And while I was at the table saw, I went ahead and just cut the back at 12 inches. 9 inches by 9 inches is the width. So that was the second cut I was doing on the table saw, and that's what it would look like all pre-assembled. After setting the height on my dado head cutter, the depth of the dados is 3/16 of an inch. That way I can get back-to-back dados on the centerpiece and not cause a problem with the structure. My stacked dado head cutter does a pretty good job, but regardless, a little bit of sanding is important to get rid of those rough edges. And now it's some glue. This is not going to use any fancy joinery for the case. It's just going to be butt joints and some nails. And you've probably seen me use these before, these corner clamps. They're really great, especially when you're working alone, to hold everything square and in place while you finish your joinery. I can get away with using the nails here because this piece is not seen on the outside. It's inside the bigger case. It's important to spread the glue out evenly. I usually use my finger or a brush. From here on in, it's just a matter of repeating the same steps to get a box. Here I'm measuring to set the center divider. Now, you may have noticed in the original drawing there were supposed to be 2 dividers, but somewhere along the line I got excited about building this box, completely forgot about the other one, so we ended up with just 1 center divider and 2 shelves. But as it turns out, it worked out okay because that meant more vinyl could be put into the box. I used that test piece on the table saw before to make sure that these pieces would fit, but this is really the last test to make sure all of it comes together. After this, I went ahead and put the back on it. Again, that's not going to be seen by anybody, so I wasn't too worried about painting it. Now we're going to start cutting the pieces for the sides and top. I had the home center cut these to 27 inches, the total width of the top, so that I could just bring them home in the car and easily cut them on my table saw to the 15.5 inches that I needed. Here I'm measuring for the center divider. Using this trick, I put the overall width on the outside and measure what the divider would be on the inside of the panels. Right before this, I cut the final width of the top, just slightly smaller than what the home center had done for me. And now I'm just prepping some edge molding for the sides. I wanted to use solid wood for this so that when we sanded it later, it looked nice and smooth. Painter's tape is a great clamp for these kinds of pieces. We'll let this sit overnight until it's nice and dry. Now back to the stacked dado head cutter. I've set it up to the width of my panels, my 3/4 inch panels, and now I'm starting with the lowest panel, down at the floor. With that dado cut, I went ahead and put in a temporary shelf and a rolled vinyl holder so that I can get the height of that middle shelf. A little bit of tweaking on the fence here, and we're good to go. This cut happens on both sides, so really important to get it right. Now, a quick reset. I have to cut all of the dados for the smaller shelves. Those are the ones on the 1/4 inch plywood. And I wanted to make sure that I had consistent cuts. So over at the miter saw, I cut a set of spacers that I could use to set the fence. You'll also notice that I was using some blue painter's tape. This plywood tends to splinter when you use the stacked dado head cutter, and the blue painter's tape just helps with that really well. Here I have to do the center divider plus the 2 sides, And again, that's why those spacers are really great. Now I'm prepping for pocket holes. These are going to be used to hold the top onto the piece. I wasn't 100% sure that that was the top I would go with in the final, so just gave me a bit of an option there later. Now some glue, and I can start assembling this. Actually, it took me a little while to figure out the right order to assemble everything in to make sure that I can get all the panels in. So this is the main dividing panel, top bottom. And you'll notice that it has a dado in the center there for the rolled vinyl holder. And here I'm just putting some glue on the back. And you'll notice that there's some pocket hole screws there. And just tighten it up, again using that square clamp to make sure everything's nice and straight. And here's the middle panel. Just set it in place so that I can get a final width on it, and took care of that on a table saw. Now I'm going to put in the bottom. Same procedure, but no pocket holes this time because I'm just going to go in from the bottom panel. No one's going to see these, they're going to be on the floor. So might as well make life a little easier. And if I had used pocket screws on the back in that spot, it would have been seen since it was low on the back of the panel. 4 screws make it nice and rigid. I made sure to screw around the center panel to give the box even more strength. And now I can put on the other side. Pretty easy now that everything's in place. And I just hold it with some clamps. With the dados cut the way I had them and the glue laid out, I didn't need to put too much pressure, so I wasn't too worried about putting cauls or anything to protect the surface. It was all going to get sanded and a little bit of paint, so all good. And now here I can put in the center divider, a little bit of glue on each side. And you can see that it's not exactly in the center. It's offset because one side is for the heat press and the other is for the vinyl holder. And again, some screws from the bottom just to hold it all together. And now I'm setting the top. With those solid wood edging pieces, the top's a little wider than the overall project, but that's okay because in a little bit we'll go ahead and get a router and trim that up. And now this is the center divider for the 1/4-inch plywood shelves. I had a mark set on the top, so I knew where the center was and just used the pocket screws to put everything together. Originally, I wasn't going to put a back on the upper portion of this cabinet, but a decision was made to add that later. Had the back been across the entire piece, I would have probably used the 1/4-inch plywood with a rabbet around and held everything in. But I had the 3/4-inch plywood left over and just used some pocket hole screws to get everything in. Now this is a skirt board for the bottom of the piece, for the front and the back. Used some leftover solid pine, primed, makes it a lot easier. Just trimmed it to width and was able to slide it in on both, again, the front and the back. I use my countersink to get the screws in below the surface, but I gotta be careful. Don't want to blow out the other side and ruin the piece. Now here's the router I promised earlier. I set some tape to protect the side from the bearing on the router bit, just using a standard laminate cutter. This also gives me a little bit of a lip, tape does. Actually, I use 2 layers. That way I can come back with a sander and take care of those burn marks. I started with the top to make sure I got the edge taken care of. Those little edges, if you hit them accidentally, will splinter the wood. So I took care of that first, and then made my way to the sides. And here's where the double tape comes in handy. That extra thickness of wood is perfect for me to be able to sand away any burn marks or other cut marks on this edge. Now we'll start cutting the shelves that hold the vinyl sheets. These are a little over 12 inches wide to compensate for the dados, and about 14 inches long since we now have a back on the piece. Best time to paint the shelves is now before they go in the piece. They'll get 2 coats of paint with sanding in between. Now more edge banding, this time a little thinner. These are going to cover all the edges on the carcass, all the ends of the plywood. I have that little auxiliary fence to make sure I don't get kicked back from the piece. If you have the full width of the fence, it can actually grab the piece and shoot it back at you. Here I'm setting some lines so I can put in some masking tape. I decided to use contact cement for the piece. That'll just make it a lot easier to put these thinner pieces of wood on. But contact cement, it can run over and wouldn't want to see that all over the carcass. So just make sure to mask the sides and get those lines straight. Now I trim the pieces to approximate length. I do that over at the table saw with a crosscut sled. That works better than the miter saw for this. I just get cleaner edges. And later on with the sander, I can take care of the full edge. Now contact cement. Contact cement comes on two parts. You do the two mating pieces. You wait for the contact cement to get tacky. Not exactly dry, but definitely not wet. And then you glue it together on contact. And it literally is on contact. You really only get one chance at it. If you were to lay it down too quickly and get it stuck, you try to lift it up, it's going to be difficult. You probably will tear the piece apart. After putting the contact cement on the carcass, I went ahead and removed the tape and just started laying the pieces in. Again, wait for it to be tacky. Not exactly dry, but not completely wet. And take your time. You want to make sure you get this right. So you can see I'm really being careful. Making sure I have good spacing on the edges, again, so that I can come in and do some sanding. I started with the top and then worked my way down the sides and then started doing the inner edges. Just got to be consistent with it. Make sure that you don't lay the piece down too quickly, or else, like I said, you'll end up having to tear it all apart. The other advantage of having used the contact cement, it's a lot faster. This all got done in less than half an hour, where if I had been doing glue up, it would have been hold the piece, tape it down, and then go back around later, a day or so later after the glue had set up. And here's the piece. I went ahead and inserted the rolled up vinyl holder, and you can see that it's really coming together. But there's always more sanding to do. Here I'm just knocking down the edges of the 12 by 12 shelves. The plywood doesn't get any other kind of edge banding or anything like that, so I had to make sure it was in a pretty good shape. Then I went ahead and put in blue painter's tape this time to mask off the face, and as before, just laid down the pieces carefully and slowly to make sure that we got consistent coverage and nice edges. And then took the sander and sand it away. Really trying to make sure that all the edges are nice and smooth, and that all the joints are level, because you sometimes can get one a little higher than the other, and that never is sightly. After everything had been sanded, dusted, and put a couple of spots with putty, I went ahead and took on my trusty sprayer and gave it 3 coats of flat white. It's really hard to do white on white because you don't see the change in sheen. So I do a 50-50 pattern to make sure that I do 50% coverage each time. And now I'm just pre-drilling for the wheels, the casters. And what I do is I just space them so that when I spin them, they don't hit any of the sideboards. Nothing too sophisticated here, 3/4 inch screws on the pieces. And again, just to make sure that the casters spin around. And here you go. And there's the finished piece, all laid out with all its materials. Pretty interesting piece. Some complicated joinery here and there, or semi-complicated, but overall really great looking. Join us next time to see what else we'll build on Rick's Woodworking.